How does a nation go from a scrappy bunch of colonies to a global giant that steers the world's economy and projects its military power across the planet? The story of the United States is more than just history. It's an epic of raw ambition, game-changing innovation, and a healthy dose of sheer luck. But really, how did it happen? How did a country born from a revolution against an empire, a nation that spent its first century mostly minding its own business, become the titan that defined the 20th century? What were the key decisions and the secret advantages that let one nation climb so high? This isn't just a history lesson. This is the story of how America became a superpower. The story of American power starts with the land itself. Long before anyone dreamed of a United States, the pieces were already on the board. You could say the U.S. won the geographic lottery. Tucked between two massive oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, the young nation was shielded from the constant wars and drama of Europe. This isolation was like an incubator, giving the country room to grow without constant foreign meddling, a luxury few other nations have ever had. And it wasn't just the coasts. The land was loaded with natural resources. Vast, fertile plains could feed a growing population with plenty left over to sell abroad. Huge rivers like the Mississippi and the Ohio were natural superhighways for trade, connecting the sprawling territory long before the first train tracks. And under the ground? Massive deposits of coal, iron, and oil, basically the entire starter kit for an industrial revolution. This incredible geography was paired with a revolutionary idea for a government. After beating the British, the nation's founders didn't crown a king. They drafted a constitution. Ratified in 1789, the U.S. Constitution created a strong central government that could unite the states but also protected individual rights and the rule of law. This stability was a magnet for millions of immigrants looking for a fresh start. Out of all this grew a powerful idea: American exceptionalism. It's the belief that the U.S. is a unique nation with a special mission to spread freedom and democracy. Part national myth, part political fuel, this idea would be used to justify everything from expanding across the continent to intervening in global conflicts. The foundation was set: a protected continent, endless resources, and a stable, ambitious political system. The stage was ready for explosive growth. For the first half of the 1800s, America wasn't trying to take over the world. It was trying to take over its own continent. This era was driven by a simple, powerful idea called manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was meant to stretch from coast to coast, spreading its way of life. The first big step wasn't a war, but a business deal. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson pulled off the Louisiana Purchase, maybe the best real estate deal in history. For just $15 million, the U.S. bought over 800,000 square miles from France, literally doubling the size of the country overnight. This one move opened up the heart of the continent and set the tone for the decades to come. And the expansion didn't stop. Florida was acquired from Spain. The Republic of Texas was annexed. The Oregon Territory was secured in a deal with Great Britain. But the biggest and bloodiest step was the Mexican-American War. After a decisive U.S. victory in 1848, Mexico handed over a massive territory that now includes California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and more. By the 1850s, the U.S. had grown from a handful of states on the coast to a nation that spanned a continent. This had huge benefits. It offered a seemingly endless supply of land and resources, which eased social tensions and attracted even more immigrants. It also created a massive internal market with no borders or taxes between states that would become the engine of the American economy. But there's a darker side to this story. The march west was devastating for the Native American populations who had lived on those lands for centuries. Through forced removals, broken treaties, and brutal wars, they were pushed aside and confined to reservations, their cultures shattered in the name of American progress. So the story of manifest destiny is two-sided. It's the story of a nation's incredible growth and the tragic story of the people who were trampled in its path. With its modern shape largely in place, the nation was about to face its greatest test, a conflict that would either break it or forge it into something new. The expansion that made America huge also highlighted its deepest, ugliest contradiction, being a nation of liberty that was built on the backs of enslaved people. The gap between the industrial North and the agricultural, slave-holding South finally tore the country apart. In 1861, the Civil War began, the bloodiest conflict in American history. The war was more than a fight to keep the country together. It was a battle for what America would be. For 4 terrible years, the nation ripped itself to shreds with the horrifying efficiency of modern industrial warfare. When it was finally over in 1865, the country was scarred but whole, and slavery was abolished. The Union's victory did 2 crucial things. It cemented the power of the federal government, making it clear the U.S. was one nation, indivisible. And by ending slavery, it cleared the way for the entire country to go all in on industrial capitalism. With the war over, America's economic engine roared to life. What followed was an era of such wild growth and change, it was nicknamed the Gilded Age. The country transformed from a farming society into the world's leading industrial power. The numbers are just staggering. Between 1865 and 1898, coal production jumped 800%. Railway track grew by over 500%. By the 1880s, the U.S. was outproducing Great Britain in steel and manufactured goods. A few things made this explosion possible. The country's natural resources provided the raw materials. Waves of immigrants from Europe and Asia provided the cheap labor for the factories and mines. And a culture of invention thrived, led by figures like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and Thomas Edison, who was busy lighting up the world. The final piece of the puzzle was the railroad. These new transcontinental lines stitched the country together, connecting Western resources with Eastern factories. A farmer in California could sell his goods in New York, and a factory in Pittsburgh could sell its steel in Chicago. This giant, seamless domestic market was a huge advantage that the bordered nations of Europe just couldn't replicate. By 1900, the U.S. had survived its worst war and built an economic machine of incredible power. It was still mostly looking inward, but it now had the muscle of a true global player. The only question was when it would decide to flex. For most of its first century, the U.S. had followed George Washington's advice to avoid getting tangled up in foreign problems. Its main foreign policy was the Monroe Doctrine from 1823, which basically told Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It was an isolationist stance, but one that worked because of the giant oceans and, frankly, the power of the British Navy. By the 1890s, things were changing. The American frontier was considered closed, factories were making more than Americans could buy, and a new generation of leaders started arguing that to be truly great, America needed to look overseas. A naval strategist named Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that national power depended on sea power. His ideas caught on with people like Theodore Roosevelt, who pushed for a big, modern navy of steel battleships to compete with Europe. This was a clear signal of America's growing ambition. The real turning point, the moment America crashed the World Power Party, was the Spanish-American War in 1898. On paper, it was about helping Cuba win independence from Spain. In reality, it was short and one-sided. The new American Navy completely crushed the old Spanish fleets. The treaty that ended the war changed everything. The U.S. suddenly found itself with a colonial empire: Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This was a huge shift for a country born from an anti-colonial revolution. As President McKinley put it, the war brought new duties and responsibilities that a great nation had to meet. This new, bolder attitude was cemented by President Theodore Roosevelt. He added his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that the U.S. could act as an international police power in Latin America. His motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," said it all. Diplomacy backed by a credible threat of force. Building the Panama Canal was the final touch, physically linking the Atlantic and Pacific and giving the U.S. Navy unmatched mobility in the region. By the early 1900s, America's quiet days were over. It had an empire, a powerful navy, and a new willingness to throw its weight around. The first half of the 20th century was defined by two world wars that destroyed old empires and redrew the global map, and it was in the fire of these wars that the United States was forged from a major power into a superpower. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, America stuck to its old habit of neutrality. For 3 years, the U.S. stayed on the sidelines, selling goods, food, and weapons to the Allies. The American economy boomed as the nation became the world's bank. But staying out became impossible. Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking American ships, finally pushed the U.S. into the war in 1917. The arrival of fresh American troops and supplies was the final push that helped the Allies win. The U.S. had shown it could tip the scales in a major European war. But afterward it retreated again, rejecting the League of Nations and diving into the isolationism of the Roaring Twenties. That brings us to the final and most important event in America's rise, World War II. When war erupted again in 1939, the U.S. was once again officially neutral. But the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed everything. America was all in, fighting a massive war in both Europe and the Pacific. What happened next was the greatest industrial mobilization in history. President Roosevelt called on the nation to become the arsenal of democracy, and American factories delivered on a scale that was hard to comprehend. Car plants started churning out tanks and bombers. Shipyards were building naval vessels at a dizzying pace. At its peak, the U.S. was making almost as many weapons as every other country, friend and foe, combined. This industrial tsunami not only fueled the Allied victory, but it also finally ended the Great Depression. When the war ended in 1945, much of the world was in ruins. The old powers of Europe and Asia were broken, their economies and cities shattered. The United States, on the other hand, was stronger than ever. Its homeland was untouched by war, its industrial power had doubled, and it possessed the most powerful military on Earth, with an exclusive monopoly on the atomic bomb. The global balance had shifted for good. In 1939, the U.S. was one of several great powers. By 1945, there were only two left standing, the United States and the Soviet Union. The age of the superpower had begun. World War II didn't lead to peace. It led to the Cold War, a tense 50-year global stare-down between the capitalist, democratic United States and the communist Soviet Union. Having learned its lesson from retreating after World War I, this time the U.S. stepped up to lead. It helped create institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF to manage global affairs. And in a game-changing move, the U.S. dollar was made the world's main reserve currency, pegging it to gold. This put America at the absolute center of the global financial system. The main U.S. strategy during the Cold War was containment, stopping the spread of Soviet communism. On the military side, this meant forming NATO, a massive defensive alliance with Western Europe, and building a global network of military bases. It also led to a terrifying nuclear arms race and bloody proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam. On the economic side, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan, pouring massive amounts of money into rebuilding Western Europe. This wasn't just charity. It was a brilliant strategic move that stabilized European economies, created new markets for American goods, and made communism look a lot less appealing. This two-superpower world lasted for over 40 years. Then it all started to unravel. The Soviet Union, crippled by a broken economy and the cost of the arms race, began to fall apart. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself was gone. The Cold War was over, and the United States was the last superpower standing. This was the unipolar moment. For a time, American dominance in politics, economics, and culture was unrivaled. Its military was bigger than the next dozen countries put together. Its movies and brands were everywhere. The journey was complete. The rebellious colony had become a global hyperpower. So, how did America become a superpower? It was a combination of incredible luck and bold moves. It started with the gift of a huge, resource-rich continent, protected by two oceans. It built on that with a stable and innovative political system that fueled growth. An ideology of manifest destiny drove the country to expand from coast to coast, creating a gigantic domestic market. That market then became the foundation for an industrial revolution that turned the nation into an economic powerhouse. Finally, America used that power in the 20th century's biggest conflicts to emerge as the world's leader, rebuilding the world order in its own image. Each step, from the Louisiana Purchase to the fall of the Berlin Wall, was a critical part of the ascent. But history never stands still. The era of a single superpower is giving way to a more complex world with new rising powers and new challenges. The big question for the 21st century is no longer how America got to the top, but what its role will be in the world of tomorrow. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next look at the forces that shape our world.